Welcome to What Matters. This is Stephen Brantley. In this episode, I sit down with Professor Joanne Gabrynowicz. Professor Gabrynowicz is the Editor-in-Chief Emerita of the Journal of Space Law, Professor Emerita of the University of Mississippi School of Law, and she was formerly with the University of North Dakota. And so we discuss the field of space law. We cover a number of topics throughout the interview. We discuss the development of space law during the Cold War era. We touch on President Donald Trump's proposed Space Force and some of the arguments for and against that. And we also talk a little bit about where we might see space law going in the future. And Professor Gabrynowicz also makes some suggestions for anybody who may be interested in getting into the field of space law. This is obviously a very important topic as we're seeing private companies like SpaceX start to make their way into space. And it leads to a lot of questions about how this new frontier is to be governed. So I hope this interview sheds some light on the topic. And I hope you enjoy this episode of What Matters. This is the donation portion of the podcast. If you've heard it before, feel free to skip ahead. If you haven't, I'll be sure to keep it short and sweet. Basically, it costs money and a good bit of time to produce this podcast. I really enjoy doing it, and I'll keep it up as long as I can. But a good bit of cost goes into it. I pay monthly fees for podcast hosting, and I also do a good bit of research for each of my guests, which usually involves buying a book. I keep an Audible subscription. So any support that you guys may provide would be much appreciated. You can find a donation link on whatmatters.libsyn.com. That's whatmatters.libsyn.com. And you can either just send a one-time donation or set up a monthly donation of a few dollars. And if you in any way can't financially support it, if in any way it'll be a strain on you, then please don't feel like you need to do it. And you can definitely support the podcast in other ways, and that could be by just sharing the podcast on social media and talking to your friends and family about it. And any support at all that you can provide is much appreciated. And if for some reason you don't want to donate via PayPal, then just let me know, and we can definitely work something else out. And when you go to the website, there is a donation button in the top right-hand corner of the page. And I will also include a donation link in podcast descriptions. And I'm asking for donations because I'll never have advertisements on here. I believe that a lot of the problems that we see in media today are rooted in the advertisement model. So I'm going to do this simply on a listener support basis. So I want to thank you for your support, and I hope you enjoy this episode of What Matters. Professor Gabrynowicz, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Yeah, you're very busy, so I'm very happy to have you on, and I'm very grateful for you to dedicate this time.
Well, you're very welcome.
So I have you on here today to talk about the field of space law. Could you briefly describe what space law is?
Okay, space law exists at the international level and the national level, and it's really an amalgam of a lot of different kinds of law. So at the international level, you will be dealing with a number of things, including arms control, data privacy, access to satellite imagery, weather data, access to space, the use and exploration of space, going to planetary bodies. At the national level, and many nations have their own national space laws, it will be, again, an amalgam of any number of things, everything from insurance to licensing to authorization of activities, intellectual property. So it's a wide variety of things.
Yeah, what's fascinating to me is it encompasses many different areas of law. How does one get into such a diverse field?
Well, it depends on when in time you're talking about. The first generation of space lawyers were looking to find an alternative to nuclear war. And in the 50s and 60s and the deep, dark days of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union and the former Soviet Union and the United States were the only two spacefaring nations, and also they happened to be very serious adversaries, the lawyers of that era worked to create a treaty regime to create an alternative to placing nuclear weapons in space. Move forward a little bit in time, and the lawyers are working in things like public international law. They will be perhaps lawyers in agencies, space agencies and defense departments, things like that, working on the missions of their agencies or their national programs. And then a little later in time, my group was looking at a number of things, including the commercialization of space. And lawyers were attracted to that. And today, very much has to do with commercial space activities and the commercialization of space. If a young lawyer comes to me today, or a law student, and says, I'd like to be a space lawyer, I would tell them that knowing space law is not enough anymore. You have to have at least two areas of expertise. It would be space law and something else, like intellectual property, contracts, export controls, other things that are definitely involved with contemporary space activities.
What specifically led you into the field? I saw that you were you were the managing partner of a firm in New York prior to teaching.
I'm a New York City kid.
And did your practice, did it focus on international relations or anything that was relevant to space law?
No, my practice was my day job. And at night, I would write and do research and prepare to go to conferences. That was my second job. I got into space law. It's a very long story. I'll keep it short. There were two things that I was very interested in. One thing is history. My undergraduate degree and a better part of an unfinished master's degree are in history, and I was very interested in the founding of the United States and Tudor and Stuart England, and that period where colonialism was transforming into a nation state, and the kinds of decisions they had to make to create and this new country, and the things they had to address. And at least in the United States, there were two things that were very, very important to them at the time. And again, this is very oversimplified, but one thing was they very much wanted to avoid the kind of incessant warring that went on in Europe,
right?
Which was where they left. And the other thing that was very important to them was they were just beginning to learn about the frontier. They were just beginning to get information, and all they knew is it was very, very big, and it was very, very rich. So they came up with two things, and this is discussed in the Continental Congress. And I promise I will get back to space in a minute. In the Continental Congress, the way they created the federal form of government was they were driven by the logic of geography which is why they called it the Continental Congress. They said, if we're going to be on one contiguous landmass, we have to organize ourselves that takes that fact into consideration. And that's how they created the federal government. Anything that involved the landmass as a whole, the landmass as they understood it at the time, that went into the federal government. So the commerce power, for example, and the treaty power, that was in the federal government. But anything that geographically only involved the local area, like education, the police power, that was retained to the states. And so this geographic logic is what created the federal system, which allowed them to get organized. The second thing that they were guided by was the frontier, that they were just beginning to understand what it was, how big and how rich. And they knew that the call of the frontier was going to be very, very strong, and that if they didn't get themselves organized before they went into the frontier, then they would turn into Europe again, a number of small states constantly at war among themselves. And so when a number of years later, I first began to learn about space, I was like most Americans. I knew we had been to the moon and back, but that was all. I really didn't know the wider variety of space activities that there really are. Everything from remote sensing to planetary research to communications and navigation. And I really began to get interested in space at that point. And this was the early to mid 80s. And people were talking about, well, now that we've been to the moon, let's go to Mars. And the planetary draw of exploring the next planet. And so I saw an analogy between what I studied in history and what going into space invited. And the analogy is that the continent is to the planet as the terrestrial frontier is to space. And just as they recognized that they shared a single contiguous landmass and how to organize themselves that way, human beings share one planet. And if we are talking about going into what was then being called the new frontier of space, for the long term, this is, human migration and planetary exploration, then we have to get organized. And I saw that space in the long term was a human endeavor, not just the endeavor of individual nation states. Well, I took that analogy and I started writing papers about it. I was what was euphemistically referred to as an independent scholar, which meant at the time I paid my own way to conferences and began giving papers on this subject. One of them was at Princeton, and I met the late Dr. David C. Webb, who started the Space Studies program at the University of North Dakota. And he had heard a number of my papers and had met me at a number of conferences. So when he began the Space Studies department, he needed somebody to teach space law, and I was offered the position. And that was in the late 80s, and I've been going ever since.
I really like your description of the atmosphere as being the equivalent of our continent. I think a lot of people look and they see it as just, it's vast, it's, never ending. A lot of people think that way. But were you inspired by Carl Sagan or the Voyager missions? I'm thinking of one photo in particular known as the pale blue dot photo that really makes you think, it's just us, this one speck of the universe. Were you
Well,
inspired by those things?
not until much later. At that time, like I said, all I knew about space before I started looking into it was we'd been to the moon. I
Mm-hmm.
hadn't thought of it in any other way. And in fact, a few years later, when I learned about what's called remote sensing, which is using the space technology to observe the planet Earth, our home, I was hooked. That I was really excited about that. But I want to go back one because I want to be very, very clear about something. Is when I talk about space as a frontier, I don't mean to advocate that we should deal with that frontier the same way the early Americans dealt with the terrestrial frontier. There was a lot of things that were done that hopefully we learned we shouldn't do, like ignoring the people who already were there and the kinds of imperial and quasi-imperial activities, some of them that occurred. Um, uh, I don't advocate for those things. What I do mean is simply the recognition that we do share a single planet, and the fate of all of us will eventually depend on how we as humans treat the planet, and that space is a frontier, but that we ought to be going as the human species and not just as individual nations.
Yeah, and we put forward back in '67, I believe, was when the Outer Space Treaty was. Was that when it was written or ratified by most countries?
Yeah, that was when it was entered into force. It was
Okay.
negotiated in the legal subcommittee for the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space in the United Nations.
Hmm.
And we have to be clear. The Outer Space Treaty came into being because both the Soviet Union and the United States, we didn't exactly know what each other was capable of. And this was only, a decade or so after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the idea of nuclear weapons were very real. And the idea of one nation or the other placing nuclear weapons in space was horrifying. And they basically looked into the abyss and said, nope, we're not going to do that. And so the Outer Space Treaty, the absolute driver to the Outer Space Treaty, was the preventing nuclear weapons from being placed in space. And that's why, in my professional opinion, the Outer Space Treaty is one of the single most important treaties of the 20th century, because, there was a lot of political pressure. There was a lot of competition between the Soviet bloc and the West, and technology was the way the competition was being carried out. And if the forces continued, it could have just as easily led to placing nuclear weapons in space. And they decided, no, we're not going to do that. So that's the importance of the Outer Space Treaty, among other things.
And it's considered kind of one of the foundational documents of international or of space law.
Yeah,
And,
it
sorry, go ahead.
functions like a constitution. It contains the basic principles by which we agree to be governed in space.
And beyond the nuclear restrictions, it also, I believe, it also has environmental suggestions that we should take into account environmental
Yep.
costs.
Article 9 addresses environmental issues, and it says that states parties to the treaty agree to avoid harm to the space environment and the Earth environment. So there are environmental principles embodied in the treaty.
And also some military ones as well. Now, my understanding, of course, we've had military personnel up in space since the beginning of,
Right.
But it says that we can't put bases on the moon or in space. Am I correct?
Article 4 divides space into two categories. One is open space. That's the space between and around planets, between and around the Earth and the moon. And in that space, the military is restricted from placing weapons, nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction, but they can engage in peaceful activities like telecommunications, navigation, things like that. And from the beginning, the military has been in space, and that doesn't mean a human presence in space, but they have operated space assets from the beginning.
Mm.
The second category under Article 4 are celestial bodies, like the lunar surface and Mars and asteroids and what we call celestial bodies. And the restrictions on the military are more clear there. And that's where the things that you mentioned are applicable, where you can't conduct maneuvers on celestial bodies, you can't do weapons testing, you can't have installations and bases. So there's this laundry list of things that cannot be done by the military of any nation on the celestial bodies.
And I think what's fascinating, I think a lot of people will take that treaty for granted. They might read it and say, "Oh, that's common sense that we try to prevent these certain things, or that we allow other countries to pursue their own goals." But that's an actual. There are many ways that a treaty or a negotiation could turn out, but we chose that particular system, which I recently read A World Order by Henry Kissinger. And it's reminiscent of the Westphalian system of governance, basically meaning that we recognize each nation's sovereign abilities, and we will let them function in their own capacity as long as it doesn't interfere with ours.
Yes, and the really important thing here was both the Soviet Union and the United States at the time did not want to be prevented from going into space. The law, as it was at the time without the treaty and with the political forces that were at play, created an incentive for both the United States and the Soviet Union to get there first. Remember, what's going on Earth is this competition where the United States and the Soviet Union are in a competition to have non-aligned nations align with one side or the other. And they do that by getting to a place first and influencing first. So neither the Soviet Union nor the United States wanted to be excluded from space. And they knew that as long as there was no reason to inhibit that, then the incentive would be for each guy to get there first, because they needed to get there first in order to prevent the other guy from excluding them from space. And so what the Outer Space Treaty says is it's a global commons, that all nations have the non-exclusive right to use and explore space. And because all nations have that right, and because it's a global commons, then even if one of them gets there first, they do not have the authority to exclude the other one. And that kind of takes the pressure off. It's a very strategic decision. By saying that space is a global commons, and that's based on the principle of res communis, meaning the thing belongs to all. By saying that everybody can use it. Everybody can explore it. Everybody can use and explore space. Then that means it doesn't matter whether you get there first or not. You still have that right. And that's kind of what took a lot of the pressure off to get there first and perhaps place a nuclear weapon.
Does this treaty? I believe it also deals with developing countries.
Well, because space is a global commons and all nations have the right to use and explore it. Another principle is that space should be used for the benefit of all nations without regard to their economic or technological capabilities.
And to date, I believe there have been 108 states that have ratified.
I checked recently, but it's a lot. I think it's more than that, but yeah.
And there are a number of other treaties that have been written since then, and but they haven't been as successful. What's different about this one? What are some of the limitations of getting additional space treaties ratified?
All right, let me come back to that because I do want to emphasize one other point before we go into that.
Sure.
There was an amazing woman named Eileen Galloway at the time in the 50s. She was a researcher at the Library Research Service, which is now the Congressional Research Service. And she was at the beginning. Lyndon Johnson, who was in the Senate at the time, wanted her to work with him. He understood the value of space. And she got involved with the beginning about how we are going to treat space, what our policies are going to be, what our laws are going to be. I mean, she was in at the very beginning. And you can find this online. She says, at the time, you have no idea how frightened everybody was, because the only thing that was being discussed about space was warfare. They did not know there were other things you could do in space. She said, then the scientists came forward and explained all these possibilities. We could do weather monitoring, we can do navigation, we can do scientific research, and this whole list of telecommunications. We can do all these things in space. And the thing Eileen said was that turned everything around. Once we knew that there were things that space could be used for other than war, that gave us the room to move forward. And that's the environment out of which these treaties came.
Well, that's really inspiring. I hope that it's good to see that people did realize that.
Have your listeners Google Eileen Galloway, and there's a recording of her. I believe it's on the NASA website, where she talks about what I just told you. It's really very powerful.
Wow. And so going back to what we were talking about before that, what were some of the limitations with these treaties, and I guess why haven't we successfully ratified any new treaties?
Okay, first we have to go back to the time of the Outer Space Treaty, because in total today there are 5 space treaties, 4 of which have been widely accepted. The first one is the Outer Space Treaty that we've been discussing. Then there's the Liability Convention. Human beings, wherever they go, they have accidents. And so liability was something that was addressed. The Return and Rescue Agreement, what happens if an astronaut and or a spacecraft lands someplace they don't intend to land on Earth, either by accident or loss or misnavigation. That's another treaty. And then the Registration Convention about registering space objects that are placed into space, analogous to registering a ship at sea. The three treaties that followed the Outer Space Treaty were all based on principles contained in the Outer Space Treaty. So, for example, the Outer Space Treaty says nations that put objects in space are going to be internationally responsible for them. And the Liability Convention comes out of that principle. The Registration Agreement and the Return and Rescue Agreement also come out of basic principles that were in the Outer Space Treaty. So you have this interlocking set of treaties which all relate back to the Outer Space Treaty. Now, the fifth treaty is the Moon Agreement, and the Moon Agreement is specifically about the moon and what would be done with resources and if resources can be extracted. That treaty is not widely accepted. In fact, it's a very politically weak treaty. I think there's about 14 or 15 nations that have accepted it. It's politically pretty toxic. And so that was a treaty that was intended to extend the basic ideas in the Outer Space Treaty, but it was not politically well received.
So what in my understanding of it is that the only nation that has the capacity to get to the moon that has actually ratified it was India, and all others have refused
France
to.
Signed it. France has signed it. France is a very leading space nation.
Okay, so what within that treaty makes it so politically challenging?
Well, the Outer Space Treaty doesn't address the question of property rights at all. It's silent. It doesn't say there are property rights in space. It doesn't say they're prohibited. They just were not addressing that at the time the treaty was being negotiated. As I said, their focus was on nuclear weapons. The Moon Agreement attempts to move ahead and clarify further what happens if you're going to extract resources from the moon. And it provides in Article 11 the provision for an international regime that would in which the members would create the rules at some time in the future for resource extraction and property rights. It would have been analogous to something like the Law of the Sea or the Antarctic Treaty. But when that treaty was negotiated, and it was submitted to the Senate in the United States. It was submitted for ratification, but there was some pretty strong national politics at the time where space advocates in the United States were very strongly against the idea of an international regime. They saw it as communistic or socialistic at the time. And so there was a strong anti-lobbying, a strong lobbying campaign not to ratify. And the treaty was withdrawn at the time. That's at the U.S. national level. And ever since then, it has constantly been argued and debated as to what it means, what it could have meant. But the fact is, it has not been widely embraced. And right now, to try to use the Moon Agreement as a starting point for something or anything would be a very uphill battle, if possible at all.
Mm-hmm. I guess I kind of understand. Is it similar to, I guess, some of the criticisms of the UN, where a nation is afraid to give up some of their sovereignty to another entity?
That is a position that is held by some in the United States and was held by some long-term powerful people in the United States Senate, where they saw treaties as mechanisms by which nations gave up some of their sovereignty. And the fact is, in any agreement, when you agree to something, you do give up something. I mean, even a simple contract, if I sell you my car and you're going to give me $500, I agree to give up my car. Yes, I do. Mm-hmm. But I agree to give it up because I get something in return. And the thing that I get in return is something that I want. So treaties are like that. Treaties are big fancy contracts where the negotiations are about what the parties want. And everybody has to get something, otherwise they don't work. But what has been happening in the last 25, 30 years or so, and this is not just about space, there simply is little to no political will to enter into new treaties on so many things. Look at the environment, how hard it is to get any kind of agreement at the international level on the environment. It's just a point in human history where the classical treaty and the classical treaty making power is not very politically accepted for a wide variety of reasons.
Right, and it's actually kind of scary because it seems like we're, going in the opposite direction right now. There's a trend, of course, of backing out of treaties, and however, there's also increased globalization and the interconnectedness between economies. But yeah, it seems like there is a focus on just short-term gains and not a consideration of the long-term cost of, if we don't establish this organization or this entity, then we could be risking a space war, basically.
There's another dimension to it as well, which is we have been seeing since the second half of the 20th century, after the end of World War II, we have been seeing the evolution of forms of agreement that are alternatives to treaties. So codes of conduct, charters, non-binding agreements, like the Paris Agreement regarding the environment. That was a legally non-binding agreement, which relied on nations volunteering to take certain actions and policing themselves. So we have been seeing the emergence of these new kinds of agreements. Sometimes they're referred to as soft law. It's a phrase or a term of art that is the subject of a lot of discussion right now. And frankly, we don't know where those things are heading. And under customary international law, you might have something that starts out life as a non-binding agreement, but maybe over time, and very long time, based on behaviors and pronouncements and various different things, something that starts out as non-binding may become binding, but we don't know. I mean, you mentioned what was the Treaty of Westphalia. At the time, that was a new way of nations. First of all, the nation state system as we understand it became a thing back then, where nations could have sovereign authority as nations and not necessarily as individual kings and those kind of mechanisms. And entering into treaties was a new kind of thing. It hasn't always been this way. I mean, treaties in the nation state system are not something you find in nature. They are devices created by human beings in order for them to conduct their activities. I think we may be at a time which is analogous to that time, the Westphalian time, where these new kinds of forms of agreements are evolving. And maybe my successor 150 years from now, who is teaching a course in space law or international law, is going to point back to this time and say, oh, that's when the nation state system and the treaty system was changing. And that's when it became the blah, 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 whatever it is. We just don't know what it is. But maybe 100 years from now, we're going to look back and say, this was the time when something changed in the nation state system and the forms of agreements. But that's a jurisprudential look at it. It's not necessarily what do we do with it today.
Yeah. Well, how exciting is that to be in such a it's not, I guess, technically not new, but it's still early in its in its research area. How exciting is that to be in a new emerging field like space law?
Well, it's like I say, it's been around since the end of World War II. We have a again, declarations, statement of principles, charters, codes of conduct. These things have been developing since the end of World War II for a number of reasons. And yeah, in human history, it's new. 100 years is a blink of an eye, but it's not like we just all discovered this last week.
Right. And so we have those 5 treaties. And who are those? I know that you work with or you've worked with the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. Is it that committee that's usually drafting these treaties?
Historically, that is where the treaties have come from. When Sputnik was launched, the realization that there were no rules for space hit hard. And the United States strategy at the time was to develop law simultaneously at the national level in the United States and at the national level in the United Nations in order to establish legal principles that were consistent with the way we thought space should be. And so the United States made proposals in the United Nations that established, and these are very historical resolutions, these resolutions established the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. And that's the place where the 5 treaties you and I have been discussing were negotiated. And that committee consists of 2 subcommittees. One is a legal subcommittee, and the other is a science and technology subcommittee. And when you think about it, law, science, and technology is what you need to be talking about if you're talking about a space treaty. So, and at the same time, in the United States, a national statute was passed, the National Aeronautics and Space Act of 1958, at the same time. So the United States has the oldest existing national space law on the planet. It's over 50 years. And some of the principles that are contained in the resolutions are also contained in that first initial statute. So that's how space law began to be developed at the national and international level.
Yeah, and that is the act that established NASA, correct?
Right. It did 2 very important things. It established NASA, It was based on a pre-existing entity called NACA, the National Aeronautics Council Administration. I forget what the acronym is. It's NACA. Mm-hmm. It was turned into NASA. And then the second thing that it did was it created a civil space program for the United States. That's also very important. And here it's important to remember who was president at the time, and that was President Eisenhower. And as you know, President Eisenhower had been the Supreme Allied Commander in World War II. And there, you don't get closer to being a deity on Earth than being a Supreme Allied Commander in World War II. And he was adamant. Remember, this is the man who warned us about the military-industrial complex. And he was adamant that the United States space program was not going to be a military program. And he said it was going to be a civil space program. The Air Force assumed that it would have the National Space Program because it was the Air Force and had the capabilities at the time that were needed. But Eisenhower had different plans, and he did not want the national program to be a military program for two reasons. One, he wanted it to stand in stark contrast to the Soviet program. The Soviet program only had a military program. There was no division between civil and military like there was in the United States. And he wanted the U.S. program to be very different than the Soviet program. And the second reason was he believed if it was put into the military, it would be a budget buster, that there would be a race for funds that would break the national fiscal policies. And that was the lesson he learned in Europe. So he was very adamant that the U.S. was going to have a civil space program, and that's how it came into being.
Eisenhower is a fascinating character because it's almost hard to imagine a general warning about the use of forces or the military industrial complex, like he said. Do you think that that's because he saw the horrors of World War II, or is he playing like a long-term game? Is he thinking
I think it's both.
Yeah,
I think it's both. I mean, he, like I said, Supreme Allied Commander, that means he had authority over the industrial bases of all of the Allies and the militaries of all of the Allies. That's a stunning amount of power in one person. And he knew what happened when you put them together. And he also knew how military budgets can tend to grow. And that's what he brought together. Eisenhower was an amazing general, but I'd also say at the time, the World War II generals, and that's another whole subject, but there was a cadre of U.S. generals during World War II that I simply don't think exists today.
Mm-hmm. And so we have those we have the act that we discussed that established NASA, and we also have those 5 treaties. What exists today? Where are we today as far as statutes and case law that has been established by international law and individual countries?
Very little case law, but it depends on how you define space law. If your definition of space law, and I would say it should be, includes things like contracts and export controls, you're going to have a lot of case law. You're going to have a lot of regulations and statutes that govern that part of it. It's not space law per se like the treaties are, but it is a very integral part of space activities overall. In the United States, at the national level, we have statutes that govern commercial launches. If you want to provide launch capabilities or services or launch vehicles for on a commercial basis, you have to go through a licensing process. There's a similar process for commercial remote sensing, which is the use of satellites to observe space. In the United States, we tend to write law as the technology matures. Other nations who have been really leading spacefaring nations for a long time, many of them didn't have national space laws until the 2000s. That was driven in large part by high-resolution commercial remote sensing, where they realized they needed to have national statutes to implement their requirements under the treaties, their obligations under the treaties, and to protect their national interests. Now we see a lot of nations developing different space laws that are being driven by different things. So, for example, even in New Zealand, they recently passed a national space law because that's being driven by the change in technologies that are creating the ability to do fast, quick launching of satellites into space on smaller vehicles. And there's a lot of demand for satellites in low Earth orbit to gather and collect data. That's the big driver now. So there are different statutes for different purposes. In the United States, we are going through a change that has been being attempted to be put in place since about 2014, an attempt to streamline statutes for all kinds of commercial space activities. It's controversial. It's very different than what we have now. The proponents of these laws say it's needed in order to simplify the ability for commerce and commercial entities to conduct profitable space activities. And so there was a proposed statute, a bill that worked its way through Congress last year that was killed at the last minute for a number of reasons. But it is being reintroduced in this Congress. And just a couple of days ago, I think it was April 15th, a notice was issued in the Federal Register by the FAA, who does the licensing of launches and various systems, has proposed a new set of very comprehensive regulations that are expected to be developed. And now we are in a comment period, which means anybody with an interest in it can go to the Federal Register, read these proposed new regulations, and make comments on them. And we'll see where that goes.
That's very interesting. I can't remember. I mean, you said that it worked through Congress last year, and then it's been reintroduced this year. I don't remember ever hearing anything about it. Has it made it into the mainstream?
Well, again, it depends on what you mean by the mainstream. Into the space mainstream, absolutely, it's made it. But space activities it's a relatively small community compared to everything else that goes on in the United States. And, think of what was happening in the last couple of years, the tax bill that went through, the withdrawal from the Paris Agreement. These were big, the healthcare attempts, both to pass healthcare and to repeal healthcare. These are big, massive subjects that touch a lot of people. And so the focus very much is on these big national activities. And a space law making its way through the lawmaking process, just like any other law does. Well, there's a very ardent group of people who follow every move. On a national level of things, it doesn't get a lot of attention.
And are you concerned with people kind of losing interest in the in space exploration and things like that? It seems like it was just a huge part of everyday life back in the 60s, but not so much now. And of course, NASA struggles to get funding.
Well, we have had a couple of generations since the Cold War, and those generations have priorities and interests that are different than those of us who grew up in the Cold War. Today, the millennials are focused on the environment, and for young people who were subjected to the economic crisis of 2008 and working their way through that with their families. Economics and healthcare are something that's very important to them and is their priority. And there's been a lot of studies where there's support for space. It's very wide. If you go to most people and say something along the lines of, do you think the United States should go into space? They'll say, yeah, that's a good idea. It's exciting. And then if you dig down and you say, should the money for that come from other areas of the budget? Then they start to listen and say, what areas of the budget? So there is a lot of there's a lot of demographic change that has reshaped the kind of support there is for space.
That actually makes me think perhaps a good way to kind of inspire more people is just to change the framing of the field. For example, it was back in the 60s, it was, our country first, let's get ahead. But now we can advocate for space environmentalism, or of course the commercialization for those that are interested in growing the economy, and that would perhaps bring more people on board.
Well, space, I love it. It's my career. I eat, dream, think space almost all the time. But I know that there are competing interests from other parts of the citizenry that need to be addressed. And for the Cold War, space was that thing we did to show the value of our system. The moon race was all about a competition between two ways of having a governance, either communism or capitalism. That was a strong contest that people understood. And because the contest was between two ways of life, space got a lot of support. Today, the thing that's generating interest, as you said, is the commercial aspects of it. But there's different kinds of commercial activities. There's the stuff that's happening close to Earth, which is in low Earth orbit, remote sensing, data gathering. That is going full speed ahead. But other kinds of space activities, like most recently asteroid mining, there was a lot of brouhaha about that in the media. It's very exciting. Space tourism, that's another thing. Spaceship One happened in, I think it was 2003 or 2004, somewhere in there. And there has been no commercial company established to bring people up to near space on a commercial basis, even though Spaceship One demonstrated the technology. Burt Rutan, who developed that technology, is on record as saying, who the hell would have thought that 17 or 18 years later we wouldn't have one company doing it? So when you talk about commercial space, it's really important to say what kind of commercial activity.
Yeah, that's one particular thing. I don't remember the treaties ever addressing tourism. I know that they've addressed mining, but
no, they don't address mining per se. The closest the language is in the Moon Treaty that says when it becomes feasible to extract resources from the lunar surface, then we will begin to develop the rules. So the treaty definitely contemplates some kind of resource extraction regime, but it didn't set out the rules for it. But it's not a question of space tourism. What's important is the Outer Space Treaty does allow for private activities in space. When the treaty was being negotiated, the Soviet Union claimed that, or argued at the time, that the only legitimate actors in space were nation states. And of course, the United States wasn't going to accept that. And the United States said, no, the private sector is a legitimate actor in space, and it should definitely be provided for. And so they reached a compromise in Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty, where it says nation states will be internationally responsible for the space activities of their non-governmental organizations. And that the nation states have to authorize, and here's the exact language, nation states have to, quote, authorize and continually supervise the space activities of their non-governmental actors. That's where you find the authority for the private sector to be in space. Because if the private sector was forbidden from going into space, there would be no need to authorize them and supervise them. But because that provision for authorization and supervision exists, that's how we know that legally the private sector can be actors in space.
What could you briefly? What's your opinion on President Trump's establishment of the Space Force?
He's going to have a hard time doing it. The two largest opponents, the two strongest opponents to the idea, is the Defense Department and the Air Force. So it's a strong political road to hoe. The Defense Department is not for the Space Force the way President Trump articulates it, is because it's going to set up another bureaucracy. And the Defense Department is nothing if it isn't an incredibly complex bureaucracy already. And they don't need another branch of the military to deal with, because dealing with the bureaucracy they have is so difficult to do. The reason the Air Force is not in favor of it is partly for the same reason, but also if the space activities are taken out of the Air Force, then the budget follows. And if you think about the kinds of things the military needs to be in space, rockets, satellites, these are very expensive, big ticket items. And if you take that money out of the Air Force budget and put it into a Space Force budget, the Air Force will not be happy with that. So, and there was a Senate hearing, I think it was about a week or 10 days ago, where at least initially the Senate is not convinced that it's needed. And ultimately, Congress has to pay for the Space Force. And it's not going to be a cheap proposition. And with the debt and the deficit and the various other things that our budget has to contend with, that's a hard ask.
Mm-hmm. It also seems like it could potentially lead to some breaches in some of the in for example the Outer Space Treaty, because it seems like it would naturally follow once you have a space force. Military training exercises would follow soon after that, which I believe is a breach of that.
Okay, what I just talked to you about was the political and economic hurdles that a Space Force would have to contend with. Regarding the legal aspects, the legality of a Space Force, and by the way, it wasn't always called a Space Force. It used to be called a Space Corps. This is not a new idea. This is something that comes up every 5 years or so. And in previous iterations of this discussion, it was referred to as the Space Corps, not the Space Force, which might tell you something there anyway. But as far as the legality of a Space Force, it would depend on what they would do and where they would do it. Those are the two criteria I would look at, because remember, it is legal for the military to be in space. It is legal for the military to be engaged in scientific activities and peaceful purposes. But as you referred to, there are restrictions. They cannot have maneuvers on the lunar surface. They cannot test weapons on the lunar surface. So if a Space Force is going to need weapons testing and maneuvers, they have to find someplace else to do it. And it can't be in space.
What are some of the major challenges going forward in space law? It seems like at some point the costs will kind of outweigh the benefits as far as perhaps a natural or a national interest. It seems like at some point we're going to discover something or start mining on the moon. Oh, and it's just going to be in the nation's best interest to keep other nations from getting to that scarce resource.
I don't know, but here you're going to have to talk to an economist. The cost of leaving Earth's gravity, getting something on the lunar surface or in space, and bringing it back down into gravity is enormous. And so far, nothing has been discovered on the moon that has such a high economic value that it would be worth going and getting and mining and bringing back and being able to make a profit on it. At one point, there was some talk about helium-3 being found on in the lunar surface, and there's been lots of scientific work done on that, and that has been pretty much discounted. In the 90s, they thought they found water on the lunar poles. Water would be very important because not only do human beings need it, but it would be a source for rocket fuel and other things. Well, that didn't turn out to be what they thought it might be initially. The scientific journal battles on that have brought that to a standstill. The demonstration that there really isn't that A, there's ice crystals there, and B, enough of it to go for it, has pretty much also been discounted. So, this idea, and this is where the frontier metaphor falls apart. The moving out into the frontier in the United States model was a very difficult thing to do. I'm not saying that it wasn't, but any place you have to bring your own air has an order of magnitude of difficulty that has to be accounted for in the cost to get there. And we need some serious economic discussion about the value of this. Now, there was a visionary scientist, the late Gerard K. O'Neill, who he was at Princeton, and he came to the conclusion that, at least at the state of knowledge at the time, there was nothing that had such economic value to go into space and bring it back to Earth. There was nothing that justified that expense. And he came to the conclusion that the overall economic value of going into space is going to be using the resources where they are and building infrastructure and activities and habitats and factories in space using the resources that can be found in the areas where to do that. And he wrote a very famous book. I'm blanking on the name. I will think of it, but if you Google Gerard K. O'Neill, you'll find the name of the book. And in that book, he sets out this whole vision of how it's possible to create settlements in space and create habitats and factories based on what could be found there. So that's a completely different way of looking at it. But the idea of going to space, finding something of value, and bringing it back, that has some serious challenges.
Do you have any tips based off of your vast knowledge of history and space law? Do you have any tips to nations or citizens, private companies, on navigating the next several decades or centuries even of space law?
I think it has to be, much of it has to be on a global basis. In other words, recognizing that this is a human endeavor. And I know right now that is not the most popular of viewpoints, but that's how I see it.
So for people that are interested in going into this field, you mentioned some tips for some law school students that might be interested in it before. Is it primarily in academia? Are there private firms or think tanks? How does space law currently exist?
All right. Well, the way I explain it is I think of space law as being on a spectrum. Okay. On one end of the spectrum is people like me. I'm an academic. I do quasi-diplomatic work. I could never have, as we say in the law, put out a shingle and made money to support myself on space law. I had an institutional base. I still do have an institutional base. And that is what has supported my work. The writing, the research, the development, the teaching, is that institutional foundation. At the other end of the spectrum are lawyers who work for companies like Boeing or Lockheed, and they will say, we are corporate lawyers. We're not space lawyers. we happen to have clients who build and sell space products. So we have to know about the existence of space law. But our work is what corporate lawyers do: transactional work, negotiating, contracts, subcontracts, all of that. That is what they do. Then in the middle of the spectrum are lawyers who work for various government entities, and that can be the Defense Department, NASA, the FAA, now more state-level institutions are being established relating to space. And those lawyers will tell you that, yes, they do space, but their job is to represent their client, who is whatever agency or entity they're with, and to help them carry out their mission. And they will do space law insofar as it relates to the mission of the agency. Now, then there's think tanks. I'll put them on the side of the spectrum with me, with institutions. Then somewhere in the middle, we've been seeing the emergence of private practice. More law firms are having practice groups where they will engage in space-related law. But it really is business law of some kind. And that is where the expertise in areas like intellectual property, export control, contracts, those things become relevant. And the majority of space lawyers I know who are in law firms don't just do space law. They are there doing something else. So one space lawyer that I know who's been in it for years, his additional area of expertise that he conducts at the firm is construction law. That's the thing that anchors him, but of course he's very active in space-related activities. Another lawyer I know, she has a practice, but she's an expert in insurance. And so her space law practice is very much related to insuring the things that go into space. That's another whole area of expertise. So for students, I would say if you want to do space law, first, and this truly is the advice I have given anybody who's ever asked me, and it's the way I've lived my own life. First, follow your heart. You know what you want to do. And if you are true to yourself, you will find a way to do what you want to do. That's the first thing. Then the second thing is understand the landscape that I just set out. That to say you're a space lawyer is more complicated than just knowing the treaties or the national statutes. It requires the knowledge of other types of things.
Yeah, well, it's such a fascinating topic, and I want to thank you very much for being so generous with your time. How can people find out more about you?
I have a website. It's www.joannegabrynowicz. I'll spell that GABRYNOWIC, C as in cat, Z as in zebra.com. So that's www.joannegabrynowicz.com.
And I will link to that in the description as well. And yeah, and it's a really well done website. It's got a list of all your publications and a ton of information.
That's why it says select. I don't have room for all of them.
Anyway, well, thank you so much.
Oh, you're very welcome, Stephen. This was a really pleasant conversation.
I enjoyed it. You have a good one.
You too. Bye-bye.